The unseen companion. The air itself seemed to rot around Blackwood's End, a forgotten mining settlement clinging to the skeletal spine of the Sierra Nevada. Elias Thorne, a man whose life was a quiet dedication to capturing the ghosts of forgotten places, felt the desolation seep into his bones the moment his worn tires crunched onto the unpaved track. He sought the profound silence of places left to decay, the kind of stillness that hummed with a spectral resonance. His camera, a heavy analog beast, was his only companion, an extension of his own keen, unsettlingly observant eye. He lived alone in an old, isolated farmhouse nestled in a valley just an hour's drive from civilization, a place where the wind sang elegies through the eaves and the nights were an ink-black canvas under a million indifferent stars. His home, with its peeling paint and ancient timbers, was a sanctuary, yet in its solitude, it often felt like a vessel adrift, waiting for something to fill its empty spaces. Today, Blackwood's End offered a feast of neglect. The sun, a pale, anemic disk, struggled to pierce the perpetual haze that clung to the canyons, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed like tormented spirits. Rusting machinery lay half-swallowed by tenacious scrub, their gears locked in a timeless agony. Collapsed shacks, their roofs caved in like broken skulls, gaped open to the elements, revealing interiors choked with dust and the detritus of lives abruptly abandoned. A profound, almost spiritual stillness reigned, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind through skeletal pines. It was the kind of silence that didn't merely lack sound, but actively devoured it, leaving an aching void. Elias moved with a practiced reverence, his boots stirring plumes of ancient dust. Each click of his camera's shutter felt like a sacrilege, a brief intrusion into a sleep that had lasted decades. He documented the peeling wallpaper in what was once a saloon, the faded lettering of a general store, the remnants of a child's rag doll lying in a crumbling doorway. He felt an almost perverse pull towards the deeper, darker recesses of the place, where the light struggled most to penetrate. It was there, in the shadowed remains of what might have been a miner's cabin, its stone chimney cracked down its length like a shattered spine, that he found it. Half buried beneath a cascade of fallen timber and layers of fine red dust lay a small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was roughly the size of his palm, its surface smooth and dark, worn by untold years. The wood was so old it had almost petrified, taking on a texture like polished stone. Its wings, though stylized, seemed poised for flight, its tiny head tilted as if listening to some unheard whisper. There were no discernible seams, no signs of glue or nails. It appeared to have been sculpted from a single continuous piece. A single dark eye, perhaps a bead of obsidian, glinted from its head, fixed on an unseen point. As Elias's fingers brushed against it, a sudden, inexplicable chill radiated from the object, a coldness that seemed to pierce his glove and sink deep into his flesh. It wasn't the ambient cold of the decaying cabin, it was a distinct internal frost. He hesitated, a prickle of unease snaking up his spine, but his collector's instinct, that irresistible urge to salvage fragments of forgotten narratives, overruled his nascent apprehension. He carefully extricated the bird from its dusty tomb. It felt unnaturally heavy, dense, and its surface was strangely smooth, almost slick, despite the accumulated grit. Holding it, he felt a strange tremor, not in his own hand, but emanating from the object, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, like a distant, low hum. He tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, a silent, illicit souvenir. The journey home felt longer than the journey out. The setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and angry reds, a backdrop too dramatic for comfort. The wooden bird, nestled against his chest, felt like a small, cold weight, a persistent, disquieting presence. He told himself it was just the residual chill from the cabin, a trick of the mind. But as he drove, the familiar landmarks of the road seemed somehow altered, the shadows deeper, the stretches of forest more menacing. He caught himself glancing into his rearview mirror, convinced he saw a fleeting shift in the darkness behind his vehicle, a shadow that didn't quite belong, a momentary distortion of the light. He dismissed it, attributing it to fatigue and the lingering, unsettling atmosphere of Blackwood's End. Back at his farmhouse, the familiar scent of old wood and beeswax usually offered a comforting embrace. Tonight, however, it seemed muted, overlaid by something else, a faint, earthy aroma, like damp soil mixed with something metallic, something vaguely reminiscent of rust and decay. He shrugged off his coat, placing the wooden bird on his studio desk among his other collected oddities, a fossilized nautilus, a shard of ancient pottery, a collection of smooth river stones. It stood out, its dark, polished surface absorbing the dim light, its single obsidian eye seeming to watch him. The first night, Elias woke with a jolt. He couldn't pinpoint what had disturbed him. The room was utterly dark, the silence absolute, yet he felt a profound sense of listening. He lay still, his breath held, straining his ears. And then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible tap-tap from the wall beside his bed. It wasn't the usual creak of old wood settling or the wind rattling a loose pane. This was deliberate, precise, like tiny knuckles rapping gently on plaster. He waited, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. It didn't repeat. He rationalized it away. A loose pipe, the house cooling, a branch scratching the exterior. But the memory of the cold bird, the metallic scent, lingered. The following days settled into an uneasy rhythm. Elias tried to immerse himself in his photography, developing the stark, haunting images from Blackwood's End. But a subtle, insidious disquiet began to weave itself into the fabric of his routine. The wooden bird sat on his desk, an inert sentinel, yet every time he glanced at it, he felt that same inexplicable chill, even when the studio was warm. He found himself avoiding its gaze, turning it slightly so its dark eye faced the wall. He started noticing things. Shadows, which he, as a photographer, was intimately familiar with, seemed to possess a newfound capriciousness. Walking through a sunlit room, he would sometimes catch his own shadow on the wall, and for a split second it would appear to lag behind him, a fraction of a second too slow, like an unwilling echo. He'd stop, turn sharply, and it would immediately snap into place, mocking his perception. He blamed tired eyes, the flickering quality of the old incandescent bulbs. Then came the sounds. Not always the tap-tap, but something more subtle, more insidious. When the house was perfectly silent, when the refrigerator wasn't humming and the wind was momentarily still, he would catch it, a faint, shallow intake of breath, a whisper of air that seemed to originate from just beyond the range of his hearing. It was never sustained, never loud enough to be certain, always receding just as he focused on it. He'd pause, holding his breath, listening intently, only to be met by the vast, empty silence of his isolated home. It was like trying to grasp smoke, a sensation that left him feeling foolish and profoundly unnerved. The persistent scent returned too, the damp earth, the faint metallic tang. He'd search for its source, checking for leaks, damp spots, but found nothing. It would dissipate as quickly as it appeared, leaving him to wonder if it was merely a phantom of his own olfactory senses, conjured by the memory of Blackwood's End. One evening, as he sat reading in his armchair, the old house groaning around him, he felt a sudden, distinct drop in temperature. Not a draft, but a localized cold, as if someone had opened a freezer door directly behind him. He spun around, his skin prickling, but there was nothing. The empty hallway stretched into shadow. The cold receded as quickly as it had come, leaving a lingering shiver. He found himself pulling his blanket tighter, a growing sense of vulnerability creeping into his usually stoic demeanor. He began to feel a pervasive sense of being observed. It was a subtle pressure on the back of his neck, a fleeting impression of eyes on him, even when he knew himself to be utterly alone. He'd glance up from his work, his gaze sweeping the empty room, his breath catching in his throat. He'd see nothing, of course, but the feeling persisted, a cold, invisible hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He started leaving lights on in rooms he wasn't occupying, a childish act he hadn't indulged in since he was a boy. Sleep became a fragile thing. He would drift into uneasy slumber only to be yanked awake by a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. The faint knocks would return, sometimes from the ceiling above him, sometimes from the floorboards below, a quiet, insistent communication from an unseen source. He'd lie there, rigid, listening to the vast, echoing silence of his house, punctuated only by the relentless thumping of his own heart. The wooden bird, he realized with a creeping dread, had been brought into his sanctuary. And with it, perhaps, something else. Something that had followed the cold, dark wood into the warmth of his home, and now was beginning to stretch and awaken, slowly, subtly, in the quiet spaces between his waking and sleeping worlds. The subtle disturbances that had begun as whispers in the dark corners of Elias's mind now began to etch themselves onto the tangible world. The faint tap-tap against his bedroom wall evolved, migrating through the house, a peripatetic rhythm that seemed to follow him. He'd hear it from the kitchen while making coffee, then from the studio as he tried to process film, a soft, insistent drumming that suggested delicate, bony knuckles. It was never loud enough to pinpoint, always just beyond the cusp of definition, a sound designed to fray sanity rather than shatter it outright. His sleep, already tenuous, became a battlefield. He'd wake in the dead of night, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, convinced he'd heard his name whispered, a dry, raspy exhalation of sound that seemed to curl around him like smoke. He'd sit bolt upright, straining his ears, only to be met by the vast, indifferent silence of his isolated farmhouse, a silence that now felt less like peace and more like a predatory hush. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its walls too close, its shadows too deep. The wooden bird remained on his studio desk, an unchanging obsidian sentinel. Elias had tried to move it, to place it in a drawer, even to take it outside, but an irrational resistance held him back. Each time he reached for it, that profound chill would radiate, not just from the object itself, but from deep within him, as if a part of his own will had been frozen. He found himself avoiding the studio entirely, the dark eye of the carving a silent accusation, a constant reminder of the breach in his carefully constructed solitude. The shadowy delays, initially dismissed as optical illusions, became more pronounced, more unnerving. Walking past a window, he'd see his reflection, and for a horrifying fraction of a second, a darker, more indistinct shape would linger just behind him, a flicker of movement in the periphery of his vision that would vanish the instant he turned his head. It was like living with a parasitic echo, a silent, mocking imitation of his own existence. He started moving slower, deliberately, testing the limits of this spectral tale, and each time the shadow would hesitate, a breath behind, before snapping back into synchronicity. It was a game, he realized with a sickening jolt, a slow, deliberate torment. The pervasive, earthy metallic scent intensified. It was no longer fleeting. It clung to certain rooms, particularly the bedroom and the studio, a cloying, coppery smell like damp soil mixed with old blood. He scrubbed the floors, aired out the rooms, but the scent persisted, settling into the very fibers of the house, a putrid signature of something unseen. It mingled with the familiar scent of old wood, creating a sickening olfactory dissonance that made his stomach churn. Then came the handprints. He found the first one on the glass of the large living room window one morning as the sun struggled to break through the persistent haze. It was a faint print, smeared and indistinct, as if pressed by a hand coated in fine dust or ash. But it wasn't his hand. His were larger, his fingers thicker. This print was slender, almost skeletal, with long, delicate fingers. It was too high for a child, too small for an adult man. He stared at it, his blood turning to ice. He wiped it away with a trembling hand, trying to convince himself it was just condensation or a trick of the light, but the memory of its unsettling shape burned into his mind. Later that week, another appeared. On the polished surface of his antique mahogany dining table, usually pristine, a set of 5 smudged imprints. Not full handprints, but the distinct, elongated marks of fingertips, arranged in a subtle arc, as if someone had gently trailed their hand across the wood. He ran his own fingers over the marks, feeling a residual chill, an imprint of something cold and foreign. He cleaned them away, his movements jerky, desperate, but the knowledge that they had been there, in his meticulously kept home, left a gaping wound in his sense of security. The silence of the house suddenly felt less empty and more occupied. The feeling of being watched intensified, becoming almost unbearable. He could feel it in the stillness of the air, the prickle on his skin, the constant awareness of an unseen gaze. He started talking to himself, muttering dismissive comments, trying to externalize the fear, to make it concrete enough to argue with. "It's just the old house," he'd say, his voice thin and reedy in the quiet, "just the wind." But the words felt hollow, a desperate plea to a logic that was rapidly deserting him. One afternoon, he returned from a supply run to town to find his studio in disarray. It wasn't vandalism, nothing was broken or stolen, but his heavy oak armchair, usually positioned squarely in front of his developing station, had been shifted several inches to the left, angled slightly towards the desk where the wooden bird sat. A stack of old photography books, neatly piled on a nearby table, lay scattered across the floor, not thrown, but as if gently pushed, their pages fanned out. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a shadow, or a sound, or a scent. This was physical. This was undeniable. He stood frozen in the doorway, the metallic, earthy scent now thick and oppressive. The room felt cold, utterly devoid of warmth, even though the afternoon sun streamed through the window. He looked at the wooden bird, its obsidian eye seeming to gleam with a subtle internal light. He felt a sudden, profound rage mingled with a primal terror. He wanted to smash it, to burn it, to rid himself of the source of this escalating nightmare. But he couldn't move. He felt paralyzed, a fly caught in a web, watching the spider slowly descend. The incidents grew bolder, less ambiguous. He'd wake to the distinct sound of footsteps pacing softly in the hallway outside his bedroom door. Not the heavy tread of a human, but a lighter, almost shuffling sound, like bare feet dragging across old floorboards. He'd hold his breath, his eyes wide in the darkness, listening as the pacing continued, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for what felt like hours, before fading into an unbearable silence. The localized cold spots were no longer fleeting. They lingered, pockets of frigid air that seemed to follow him from room to room. He would enter his kitchen, and the air by the refrigerator would be icy, then move to the living room, and the cold would be concentrated by his armchair. It was as if something was breathing frost into his home. The distant breathing, too, became clearer. It was no longer a whisper. He'd hear it distinctly when the house was quiet, a shallow, uneven intake and exhalation of air almost directly behind him or just over his shoulder. He'd spin around, his heart leaping into his throat, but there was never anything there. Yet the sound was so real, so immediate, that he could almost feel the phantom breath on his neck. He started sleeping with a lamp on, a weak beacon against the encroaching darkness. He tried to tell himself he was cracking, that the isolation was finally getting to him, but the evidence was too persistent, too specific. One night, the terror reached a new crescendo. Elias had finally drifted into a fitful, exhausted sleep, the lamp on his bedside table casting a weak circle of light. He was pulled from the depths of a nightmare by an overwhelming sense of presence, a cold, heavy weight settling over his chest. His eyes snapped open. He wasn't dreaming. Standing at the foot of his bed, bathed in the dim amber glow of the lamp, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly slender, its form indistinct, hazy at the edges, like an image viewed through heat haze. It wasn't fully opaque, more like a shimmering distortion in the air, a darker void against the already dim room. He couldn't make out features, only the suggestion of a head, a torso, long attenuated limbs. It seemed to be leaning slightly forward, its head tilted, as if observing him with an unnerving curiosity. Elias couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. His muscles locked, his vocal cords seized. A primal, suffocating fear clamped down on him, colder and more absolute than anything he had ever known. He could feel its gaze, a hollow, piercing awareness that seemed to strip him bare, exposing his deepest terrors. The metallic, earthy scent was overpowering now, filling his lungs, choking him. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. One moment it was there, a terrifying sentinel at the foot of his bed, and the next, the space was empty, filled only with the faint lamplight and the violent, ragged gasps of Elias Thorne. The cold lingered, an invisible shroud, and the earthy, metallic scent still stung his nostrils. He lay there, trembling, bathed in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs with punishing force. He wasn't imagining it. He couldn't be. The figure, the presence, the thing he had seen, however briefly, however indistinctly, was real. It had crossed a threshold, moving from the periphery of his senses to an undeniable, terrifying manifestation. It was in his home, in his bedroom, watching him sleep. He scrambled out of bed, his legs unsteady, and stumbled towards the window, tearing back the curtains. The moon hung low and bloated in the bruised sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the desolate landscape surrounding his farm. He felt a profound, chilling realization settle over him, heavy as a tombstone. It wasn't just in his house, it was with him, it had followed him, and it wasn't leaving. The wooden bird, sitting silently on his desk in the other room, was no longer a mere souvenir. It was a tether. A dark, inescapable connection to something ancient and malevolent, something that had finally awakened and now had a name for its companion, his name. Part 3. The immediate aftermath of seeing the figure at the foot of his bed was a jagged precipice of terror. Elias Thorne lay hyperventilating, the sickly sweet metallic tang of fear thick in his throat, his heart a frantic, dying bird trapped in his rib cage. He scrambled from the bed, his legs like water, stumbling over to the wall and pressing his back against its cold plaster, as if seeking to melt into the very structure of the house, to become invisible. He didn't sleep again that night. He sat hunched in a chair, lamp blazing, eyes darting, muscles coiled, waiting for the shimmering distortion to reappear, for the elongated limbs to once again materialize from the shadows. The house groaned around him, the familiar sounds of old timber now sounding like the slow, deliberate respirations of something vast and ancient stirring in the darkness. With the dawn, a fragile, brittle composure returned, but it was shattered by a terrifying certainty. He was not alone. The subtle signs, the faint knocks, the delayed shadows, the distant breathing, they were not products of a weary mind. They were the slow, deliberate unfurling of a presence, a malevolent seed that had germinated in the soil of his solitude. And it had finally shown itself. The wooden bird sat on his studio desk, its obsidian eye gleaming with an unnerving sentience, a dark, silent promise. Elias approached it with a new guttural fear. He tried to pick it up, to throw it out, to smash it against the wall. His hand trembled as he reached for it, that profound, unnatural cold radiating from its surface, seeming to seep into his very bones, freezing his will. His fingers brushed against its smooth, dark wood, and a jolt, not of electricity, but of pure, distilled dread, shot through him. He couldn't grasp it. It was as if his hand, his mind, refused to complete the action. A primal, suffocating resistance held him captive. He retreated, leaving the bird untouched, its silent gaze following him, mocking his impotence. The entity, now emboldened by its manifestation, shed its cloak of subtlety. The house became a stage for its increasingly aggressive displays. One morning, as Elias stood in the kitchen, attempting to brew coffee with hands that shook uncontrollably, a heavy ceramic mug sitting innocently on the counter suddenly lifted a few inches into the air, hovered for a sickening second, and then shattered against the wall with violent force. Shards flew, coffee grounds sprayed, and Elias yelped, leaping back, his heart slamming against his ribs. The metallic, earthy scent was suddenly overpowering, thick and cloying in the air. Later, in his studio, as he tried to distract himself by sorting through negatives, the air around him became impossibly cold, the temperature plummeting in an instant. The heavy oak armchair, the same one that had been shifted, began to creak, then scrape, then slide across the wooden floor, moving on its own with a slow, deliberate scrape, dragging its weight towards him. He backed away, pressing himself against the far wall, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror as the chair stopped, perfectly positioned, facing him, as if inviting him to sit, to become its captive audience. The whispers, once faint and indistinct, grew clearer, more insidious. They no longer seemed to come from just beyond his hearing, but from directly behind him, a dry, raspy breath against his ear. Elias, it would hiss, a sound like sandpaper on dry bone, his name, stretched and distorted, made utterly alien. Sometimes it was just his name, a chilling recognition. Other times, it was a fragment of an unknown tongue, guttural and ancient, the words like pebbles rattling in a hollow chamber, conveying a sense of immense age and impenetrable malice. He would whip around, his hands raised instinctively as if to ward off a physical blow, only to find empty air, the cold lingering like a phantom touch. Sleep became an impossibility. He spent nights huddled in a corner of his living room, a shotgun across his lap, its cold steel a futile comfort against an enemy that could not be shot, could not be contained. He was gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot, haunted by perpetual terror. He spoke to himself constantly, muttering pleas, demands, insults into the empty air, desperate to elicit a response, to understand. But the entity remained silent, communicating only through its escalating violence. The peak of its aggression came one late afternoon. Elias was in the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face, trying to shake off the persistent lethargy and dread. As he straightened, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror, and behind him a dark, elongated shadow that seemed to writhe and stretch, filling the small room. He spun around, his breath catching, his throat dry, but there was nothing, only the sterile tiles and the gleaming porcelain. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. The shower curtain, usually neatly drawn, began to ripple, slowly, deliberately, as if an unseen hand were pulling it back. He watched, transfixed, as the curtain was drawn fully open, revealing the empty tub. And then, slowly, meticulously, it began to draw itself closed again, not with a sudden snap, but with a languid, unnerving grace, as if an invisible being were performing a slow, terrifying pantomime. A wave of nausea washed over him. He felt a profound sense of violation, of being utterly exposed. He wanted to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. As the last fold of the curtain settled into place, a sudden, brutal force slammed into his back. He gasped, stumbling forward, his head hitting the edge of the sink with a sickening thud. Pain exploded behind his eyes, and he slid to the floor, disoriented, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. He lay there, dazed, tasting copper and dust. Before he could even register the pain, he felt a sudden, ice-cold grip fasten around his ankle. It was not gentle, not a fleeting touch. It was a firm, unrelenting hold, like fingers made of frozen iron. His breath hitched in his throat as he was dragged, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, across the cold bathroom tiles. He scrabbled at the floor, his fingernails tearing, trying to find purchase, but it was useless. He was pulled across the threshold, into the darkened hallway, his head bumping against the doorframe, the grip on his ankle relentless, cold, utterly inhuman. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized him. He screamed, a hoarse, ragged sound that tore from his throat, echoing hollowly in the otherwise silent house. He kicked, thrashed, tried to twist free, but the grip held, inexorable. He felt himself being pulled further down the hallway, towards the studio, towards the dark, silent sentinel of the wooden bird. He saw the faint, shimmering distortion in the air ahead, a deeper ripple in the shadows, and knew with a horrifying certainty that he was being delivered to it. His arm scraped against the wall, a searing pain, but the cold grip on his ankle was worse, a numbing, paralyzing terror. He was dragged through the studio doorway, his eyes fixed on the desk where the wooden bird sat, its single obsidian eye glinting, reflecting the dim light, seeming to pulse with a malevolent glee. He was being pulled directly towards it, his body an offering. Just as he felt his head brush against the leg of the desk, the grip on his ankle vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. He lay sprawled on the floor, gasping, sobbing, his body aching, his mind reeling. The metallic, earthy scent was so potent it was almost visible, a shimmering haze in the air. The cold was absolute, piercing, not just the temperature of the room, but an internal frost that seemed to settle in his very soul. He slowly pushed himself up, his eyes never leaving the wooden bird. It sat there, inert, silent, yet it radiated an immense, palpable power, a dark gravity that drew his gaze. He knew now, with a chilling certainty that went beyond reason, beyond sanity. This wasn't merely a haunting, this was a claiming. And the wooden bird, his souvenir from Blackwood's End, wasn't just a conduit, it was an anchor, a part of something or someone inextricably bound to him. As he looked at it, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the desk, and he heard it again, not a whisper, but a dry, rustling sound, like ancient leaves stirred by a breeze, emanating from the bird itself. A single, profound word seemed to form in his mind, echoing with a terrible finality, though no sound passed the bird's wooden beak. Mine. He was trapped in his own home with an unseen, aggressive entity that had now physically assaulted him, dragging him like a rag doll. The wooden bird, a seemingly innocent carving, was the key, the binding, and he could not bring himself to destroy it. He was a prisoner in his own skin, tethered to a nightmare he had unknowingly invited into his life, a nightmare that was only just beginning to reveal its true, horrifying nature. Part 4. The terror of being dragged across his own floor, a sensation so utterly violating, had finally stripped Elias of any pretense of control. He was no longer battling hallucinations or rationalizing strange occurrences. He was a captive, his body bruised, his mind fractured, in a home that had become a sentient, hostile entity. The gash on his forehead, a stark, angry line, was a physical testament to the entity's malevolence. He stared at the wooden bird, its dark eyes seeming to throb with a dull inner light, and the word "mine" echoed in the silent chamber of his mind, a chilling pronouncement of ownership. Days blurred into an agonizing cycle of fear and exhaustion. Elias stopped eating, stopped sleeping, his existence reduced to a raw, trembling nerve. He moved through the house with a desperate, hunted vigilance, his eyes scanning every shadow, his ears straining for the slightest sound. The shotgun, once a symbol of futile defiance, now lay forgotten in the corner. What good was it against something without flesh or blood, something that could drag him, whisper his name, and manifest as a shimmering void? The entity no longer bothered with subtlety. Its presence was a suffocating blanket, a constant, invasive awareness that pressed in on him from all sides. The metallic, earthy scent was now permanent, a sickly sweet perfume that clung to his clothes, his skin, even his breath. He was marinated in the stench of decay. Objects now moved freely, violently. Lamps would swing wildly on their chains, books would fly from shelves, crashing against walls. His carefully curated photographs, developed with such passion, would be torn from their frames, slashed, or defaced with strange, indecipherable symbols scrawled in an unseen hand. It was an attack on his identity, on his life's work, a systematic dismantling of everything he held dear. He would cower in corners, watching in horrified paralysis as his possessions were desecrated, his sanctuary transformed into a chaotic battlefield. The whispers intensified, becoming an almost constant chorus, a cacophony of dry, rasping voices that seemed to emanate from the very air around him. They spoke in that ancient, guttural language, a torrent of incomprehensible sounds that still managed to convey pure malice, a mocking, triumphant glee. Sometimes, among the harsh syllables, he would discern fragments of his own name, twisted and drawn out like a scream caught in a dying wind. He would clap his hands over his ears, pressing hard, trying to shut out the torment, but the sounds seemed to penetrate his skull, vibrating in his very bones. One afternoon, driven to a desperate, suicidal edge, Elias tried to leave. He grabbed his car keys, his heart hammering with a frantic, desperate hope. As he reached the front door, the heavy oak door slammed shut with a thunderous crack, shaking the entire house. He spun around, his breath catching, to see the two bolts, usually open, now slid firmly into place, the brass glinting mockingly in the dim light. He fumbled with them, his fingers clumsy with terror, but they were locked, jammed tight, utterly unyielding. He tried the back door, then the windows, but each attempt was met with the same unseen, insurmountable resistance. It was as if the house itself had become a living, breathing prison, its walls, doors, and windows sealed by an invisible force. He was truly trapped. The figure, the shimmering distortion, began to appear more frequently, more concretely. It would manifest in the periphery of his vision, a sudden, darker void against a wall, a flicker in a darkened doorway. He would catch glimpses of its elongated form, its head tilted, its attenuated limbs seeming to stretch and contract. It never fully solidified, always remaining on the edge of perception, a terrifying phantom. But its presence was undeniable, a cold, heavy weight that seemed to follow his every move. One evening, as twilight bled through the grim windows, casting the house in a sickly, bruised light, Elias found himself in the studio, drawn by an irresistible, horrifying fascination. The wooden bird sat on the desk, its obsidian eyes seeming to pulsate, radiating a cold, dark energy. He felt compelled to approach it, as if pulled by an invisible string. As he stood before it, his breath shallow and ragged, the air around him became impossibly cold, the scent of damp earth and rust overwhelming. Then, from the desk itself, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor began. It wasn't the house settling, it was distinct, emanating from the surface beneath the bird. The tremor grew, becoming a palpable vibration, and then, slowly, agonizingly, the wooden bird began to move. Not by sliding or falling, but by lifting itself. It rose an inch, then two, hovering in the air above the desk, suspended by an unseen force. Its obsidian eye seemed to glow, radiating an intense, malevolent focus. Elias gasped, stumbling back, his hands pressed against his mouth to stifle a scream. The bird hovered, motionless, directly in front of him, its dark eye fixed on his own. And then the true horror began. The wood of the bird, which had always been smooth and inert, began to change. It rippled, subtly at first, then more dramatically, as if something liquid were flowing beneath its surface. The dark, polished grain seemed to shift, to expand and contract. Tiny hairline cracks began to spiderweb across its surface, like ancient parchment tearing. From these cracks, a faint, wispy mist, black and acrid, began to seep, curling upwards like smoke from a dying ember. The bird began to pulse, a slow, rhythmic contraction and expansion that mimicked a beating heart. The obsidian eye seemed to grow larger, darker, absorbing all light, becoming a fathomless void. And from its tiny, stylized beak, a low, guttural sound began to emanate, a sound that was less a whisper and more a deep, resonant hum, a vibration that rattled Elias's teeth and vibrated through the floorboards. As he watched in paralyzed horror, the bird's form itself started to distort. The stylized wings seemed to elongate, to thin, becoming more skeletal, more avian, but in a profoundly unnatural way. The tiny head stretched, the beak sharpened, and the single obsidian eye swiveled, following his every terrified twitch. The black mist thickened, swirling around the now grotesque carving, taking on a form, a suggestion of movement within its inky depths. The whispers intensified, not just from the air, but seeming to emanate directly from the pulsating, transforming bird. They were clearer now, more distinct, a chorus of dry, rasping voices, all speaking in unison, converging on a single horrifying truth. We are Legion. Elias stumbled further back, hitting the wall, his head lolling. He was suffocating, not from lack of air, but from an overwhelming, crushing weight of spiritual dread. The entity was not merely haunting him, it was revealing itself, slowly, painfully, through the very object he had brought home. The wooden bird was not just a conduit, it was a vessel, a container for something ancient, something collective, something that had been dormant for decades, perhaps centuries, in the forgotten earth of Blackwood's End, and he had awakened it. As the transformation continued, the mist swirling faster, the bird's form becoming more fluid, more monstrous, Elias felt a sudden searing pain in his chest, as if an invisible claw had clamped around his heart. He gasped, falling to his knees, clutching at his shirt. The pain intensified, a crushing pressure, and he felt a profound, chilling cold spread from his sternum, radiating outwards, freezing him from the inside out. He looked up, his vision blurring, at the hovering, transforming bird. Its obsidian eye seemed to lock on to his, and in that instant he saw it. Not just a reflection, not just a darkness, but a fleeting, horrifying image within its depths. A vast, subterranean chamber, choked with dust and shadow. Countless similar wooden birds arranged on ancient shelves, their obsidian eyes all glinting, all watching, all waiting. And in the center of that terrible vision, a single immense skeletal hand, its fingers like ancient roots, reaching for him. The bird pulsed one last time, a dark, rhythmic beat, and then, with a soft thump, it dropped back onto the desk, inert once more. The black mist dissipated, the cracks vanished, the wood returned to its smooth, dark surface, its obsidian eye once again a silent, unblinking bead. But Elias knew. He knew the true, horrifying nature of his unseen companion. He wasn't just being haunted by a single entity. He had brought home a piece of a collective consciousness, an ancient, malevolent swarm. And the wooden bird was merely one of its many eyes, one of its many anchors. And now he was one of them too, a host, a vessel. His own body, his own mind, was no longer his own. It was merely a temporary dwelling for something that had been waiting patiently for a way out of Blackwood's End. And he, Elias Thorne, had provided it. Part 5. The crushing revelation that he was not merely haunted, but chosen, a host for a collective consciousness, settled over Elias Thorne like a shroud woven from cold despair. The searing pain in his chest had subsided, but in its place, a profound internal chill had taken root, radiating outwards, numbing his extremities, freezing his very will. His body felt alien, a vessel no longer solely his own. He was merely a temporary dwelling, a fragile container for something ancient and vast. The word mine echoed not just in his mind, but seemed to reverberate through his very bones, a possessive hum. The wooden bird, now inert on the desk, its obsidian eye a silent, unblinking bead, no longer seemed a simple carving. It was an anchor, a dark, pulsing heart from which an unseen, insidious network of malevolence extended. He was a node in that network, a new, living conduit. Sleep became a forgotten concept. Elias existed in a perpetual state of hyper-awareness, his nerves frayed, his mind a fractured mosaic of terror and forced excidity. He felt the entities, the legion as they had called themselves, moving within him. It wasn't a physical sensation, not like parasites, but a subtle, pervasive alteration of his thoughts, his desires, his very sense of self. He would find himself staring blankly at a wall, an urge rising within him to walk, to leave, to go somewhere he didn't recognize. His hands would twitch, desiring to touch objects, to rearrange them, not in his own orderly fashion, but with a strange, almost ritualistic precision. He'd catch himself speaking in that ancient guttural language, a low murmur escaping his lips, words he didn't understand, yet felt compelled to utter. The whispers were no longer external, they were internal, a constant chittering chorus in the back of his mind, 1,000 tiny voices vying for dominance, each one a fragment of the collective. They spoke of Blackwood's End, of the cold earth, of waiting, of the long sleep, and now of release. They spoke of him, Elias Thorne, their unwitting liberator, their chosen path. He tried to fight back, to reclaim his mind, his body. He would clench his fists, scream silent protests, try to focus on his own memories, his own identity. But the internal whispers would rise to a crescendo, a cacophony of ancient voices that drowned out his own thoughts, overwhelming him with a wave of profound, soul-crushing exhaustion. His own will felt like a flickering candle in a hurricane. One desperate afternoon, Elias stumbled back to the studio, his eyes fixed on the wooden bird. He knew, with an agonizing certainty, that it was the key, the source, the nexus of his torment. He had to destroy it. He had to sever the connection, even if it meant destroying himself in the process. He picked up a heavy steel paperweight, its cold weight a reassuring anchor in his trembling hand. He raised it, his arms shaking, his teeth gritted in a silent snarl of defiance. But his hand wouldn't obey. It froze in midair, rigid, as if held by an invisible vice. An excruciating pain shot through his arm, a searing, burning sensation that felt like his muscles were tearing, his bones twisting. The whispers in his mind exploded into a furious roar, a torrent of ancient rage that threatened to rip his skull apart. He screamed, a guttural, inhuman sound, as his arm slowly, agonizingly lowered itself, the paperweight falling from his numb fingers with a dull thud. He was bound, not by chains, but by his own hijacked physiology. The house, too, became an active participant in his imprisonment. When he stumbled towards a window, desperate for a glimpse of the outside world, the glass would fog over, obscuring the view. When he tried to force open a jammed door, the wood would groan and splinter, but the door itself would remain unyielding, as if rooted to the very foundation of the earth. The air would grow impossibly thick, suffocating him, the metallic, earthy scent so potent it felt like he was breathing liquid decay. He was living in a tomb, and the walls were closing in. The entity had begun to exert a more chilling form of influence. Elias would find himself performing strange, meaningless tasks. He would move furniture, not with the deliberate push of a poltergeist, but with his own hands, his own body, compelled by an unseen force. He'd rearrange his photography equipment into esoteric patterns, meticulously stack discarded negatives into strange pyramidal forms. He would stand for hours in the darkest corners of rooms, his head tilted, listening to the silence, waiting. Waiting for what? He didn't know, but a deep, primal part of him understood the compulsion. His reflection in any polished surface became a source of profound horror. His face was gaunt, bruised, his eyes sunken and rimmed with purple, but it was not merely his physical deterioration that terrified him. Sometimes, in the murky depths of a window pane or a dark mirror, he would catch a glimpse of something else in his eyes, a flicker of malevolent intelligence, a cold, predatory gleam that was utterly alien, utterly not him. It was the entity looking out through his eyes, observing its new domain. The climax arrived on a night that felt older than time itself. The moon was obscured by a thick, bruised haze, the stars hidden behind a suffocating blanket of clouds. The house was utterly silent, yet it thrummed with a profound, terrifying energy. Elias stood in his studio, drawn there by an irresistible pull, his body rigid, his mind a battleground of internal whispers and his own dying consciousness. The wooden bird sat on the desk, its obsidian eye glowing with a soft internal light, illuminating the ancient cracks that now permanently marred its surface. The familiar metallic, earthy scent was overwhelming, almost palpable, like breathing raw pulverized ore mixed with the scent of a grave freshly disturbed. The cold in the room was absolute, beyond any natural temperature, a chill that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of existence. Then the wooden bird began to vibrate, not a subtle tremor, but a violent, shuddering pulse that rattled the desk, the floorboards, the very foundation of the old house. The cracks in its dark wood widened, becoming gaping fissures, and from within them the black, acrid mist began to pour forth, not in wisps, but in thick, roiling clouds that quickly filled the studio, obscuring his vision, choking his breath. The whispers in his mind ceased, replaced by a single deafening hum, a low, resonant drone that resonated deep within his chest, vibrating through his very heart. Elias felt his own body begin to contort, his muscles tightening, his limbs spasming uncontrollably. A searing pain shot through his entire being, as if countless invisible needles were piercing his flesh, burrowing deep. He screamed, a sound that was abruptly cut short, for his mouth, too, clamped shut, his jaw locked by an unseen force. As the black mist swirled around him, thickening into an impenetrable vortex, the wooden bird began to glow, its obsidian eye burning with an incandescent, malevolent light. It lifted from the desk once more, hovering in the swirling darkness, no longer a carved bird, but a pulsating, living entity, its form shifting, expanding, becoming something vast and indescribable. And then he saw them. Within the black mist, not one, but hundreds of eyes began to appear. Not the single obsidian eye of the bird, but countless, glinting, dark beads suspended in the swirling darkness, each one fixed on him. They blinked, slowly, deliberately, a silent, terrifying chorus of observation. And from the very heart of the mist, a vast skeletal hand, its fingers like ancient twisted roots, began to coalesce, reaching out not towards the wooden bird, but directly towards him. The true horror dawned on Elias in that final agonizing moment, a realization so profound, so absolute, that it shattered the last vestiges of his sanity. The wooden bird was not just a vessel, it was the vessel, but it was old, decaying, its power waning. They, the Legion, the collective consciousness of Blackwood's End, had been waiting for a new, fresh, more robust vessel, waiting for a new anchor. He had not merely brought something home with him, he was the something. He was the next one. The vast, skeletal hand closed around him, not with physical force, but with a cold, spiritual embrace that tore at his very essence. He felt his mind unraveling, his memories scattering like dust motes in a gale. His sense of self, his identity, Elias Thorne, the man who sought the ghosts of forgotten places, was being systematically dismantled, absorbed, subsumed. The whispers in his mind returned, not as tormentors, but as a welcoming chorus, 1,000 voices melding into one, filling the void where his own thoughts had been. He was dissolving, becoming part of the collective, another eye, another voice, another fragment of the Legion. His body, once his own, was now a new, living wooden bird, a fresh anchor in the world, ready to be placed on a desk, ready to wait for the next unwitting collector. The black mist cleared. The studio was silent once more, the air still thick with the metallic, earthy scent. The wooden bird sat on the desk, inert, its obsidian eye dark and unblinking. But standing beside the desk, motionless, was Elias Thorne. His eyes were wide, vacant, staring blankly ahead. His face was devoid of expression, a mask of profound, ancient stillness. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through his body, a low, rhythmic vibration, like a distant, low hum. He was still. He was waiting. He was watching. And from deep within him, a single dark thought pulsed, not his own, but belonging to the Legion, ancient and patient. Mine. Ours. Always. And from deep within him, a single dark thought pulsed, not his own, but belonging to the Legion, ancient and patient. Mine. Ours. Always.